Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. The differences are stark. Women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with a mood disorder and to be prescribed antidepressants. Girls aged 15 through 17 are twice as likely as boys to be hospitalized for mental health concerns. This is something that Misty Pratt has wrestled with, and why it is that women and girls suffer disproportionately in their mental health. She has dealt with anxiety and depression in her own life, and see her grandmother struggle with mental illness as well. And so in a new book, she investigates the roots of the gender gap in mental health and finds a system that she says is failing women. Misty Pratt is a writer in Ottawa. Her new book is All in Her Head, How Gender Bias Harms Women's Mental Health. She's in our Ottawa studio. Misty, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. At the very beginning of this book, you talk about your grandmother, and you say, I was 5 years old when my grandmother lost her mind. Tell us a little bit about who she was and what she went through.
My grandmother was a really wonderful woman. We were quite close. We had a lot in common. She was very interested in the arts and the theater, and so she would take me out to the theater all the time. And it was one of those nights that we had gone out to see, I think, a ballet, and we were in downtown Toronto. And I have some memories of this, but I think a lot of it has been filled in by my parents. But what happened that night was that she had a first episode of mania, and was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I can remember feeling quite scared. We managed to get my parents on the phone, and then they came and picked me up. And that was the start of a very long journey for her.
How did you understand, again, remembering what you remember, but also what you've been told, how did you understand what was going on with her at the time?
Yeah, this was the 1980s, and I don't think we really talked about mental illness very much back then. I certainly don't blame my parents for that. I just think it's not something that was part of our conversation. And so I think it might have been explained to me as your grandmother's just very sick.
She was ultimately, as you mentioned, diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. At the time, how was she treated?
She was bumped around a lot because they didn't know what was going on. So her original symptoms were very physical. She was having, speech issues, shakiness. And so they thought maybe mini stroke. Her husband was an alcoholic. And so they thought at one point she was an alcoholic. And so she was in and out of emergency rooms for a while. And she was put on 4 different medications to just try different things. Some of them didn't work very well. And eventually got to a point where she was stable enough, but never stayed stable for long and moved to a nursing home at quite a young age in midlife.
What impact did that experience have on you later in your life, as a teenager, when, as I said in the introduction, you started to grapple with mental health issues?
Mm-hmm. So I think when it happened to me, the explanation, either I gave myself this explanation or somebody told it to me, was that it was genetic. I had inherited something from my grandmother, and it wasn't bipolar, but I was certainly very ill. I was able to still go to school, but I had to enter outpatient treatment for about a year. And I was also told it was a chemical imbalance. It was something in my brain that was causing me to be sick. And to fix that, I had to go to therapy and I had to take medication. But that never helped for very long. And I struggled throughout my teens and my 20s with mental illness.
Do we know whether genes play any role at all in mental illness?
I think most scientists would agree that it doesn't play a starring role for common mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. When you look at something like schizophrenia, for example, yes, there have been genes that have been identified that play a bit more of a role. But I think for what most of us might be experiencing, they haven't really found many genes that we could attribute to it.
How does that lead you to this book?
Yeah, so I think when I started to reflect on my own experience, there was this moment that I had. I was listening to actually a radio program on CBC Tapestry, and there was a guest, John O'Donoghue, on who had talked about that there's a place inside of us where we are not broken. And I thought to myself, how long have I lived now thinking that there is something broken about me? And when I explored that idea culturally, I could see that females have always been thought to be dysfunctional in some way or have been born with some pathology with our bodies and our minds. And so I thought, is there more to it than this, than my broken brain. And that's when I really started to home in on a lot of the social issues that could be contributing to much of our suffering.
I read through some of the numbers in the introduction that girls in this country, age 15 through 17, are twice as likely as boys that age to be hospitalized for mental health concerns. Women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with a mood disorder and prescribed antidepressants. Mm-hmm. What's going on biologically, do we think? Is there something going on biologically?
Oh, I think absolutely there's something biological there. If we look at the age range, 20 to 55 years is around the time when the risk is highest. In fact, midlife, it's 5 times as likely. So there's definitely something potentially, if you're assigned female at birth and you're going through specific reproductive stages in your life, that perhaps these hormonal changes are causing more vulnerability or risk to mental illness. So there's something there. But I think what they're finding more and more is that these changes in the brain are very unique. And so it's not universal to any person who's assigned female at birth. And in fact, it looks like gender might be interacting with our biological sex and with our biology in general to change how our brain is structured and how it functions.
Tell me more about that and what else you think is going on.
Yeah, so if you look at things like puberty, for example, around the time of puberty, there is a lot going on in our brain in terms of the brain restructuring, pruning, so really kind of getting those neural connections all set up. And they've done research to look at girls who are under stress during puberty or perhaps experience trauma or stress earlier on in life. And what they suspect or what they're proposing is that there's these changes to the brain that dampen the stress response system so that we are supposed to have a nice spike in cortisol when something stressful happens to us, because that way the body then responds with our rest and digest phase. But it seems that this chronic stress for girls is changing our brains in ways where our stress response is dampened and may in fact then be prolonged or continue.
Is there science behind that?
There is science, but it's certainly not set in stone. It's a theory, and we don't know enough right now because there hasn't been enough data. There hasn't been enough in the way of brain scans and looking at the biology. We just are lacking that data to really give a good answer.
I want to come back to this, but you have a line in the book that says, "What about men?" And part of this is about when we say that women are more likely to be diagnosed with a mood disorder, is that because they're being diagnosed because they're going in because men may be traditionally, culturally resistant to seek medical attention, care, what have you? How do you unpack that?
Yes, I think that plays a role. So help-seeking behavior has been shown in literature that women tend to, we have a problem, and so we go in and we get the help for that problem. But that doesn't explain all of it. So in a really large study that was done in Spain that I reference in the book, over 2,000 individuals, what they found was that a doctor could have the exact same criteria in front of them, but when a man enters that room and describes symptoms, and then a woman enters the room and describes the exact same symptoms, it's 2 times more likely that woman is going to leave with a mental diagnosis. So you have to wonder what is going on the care provider side that is causing them to see certain emotions in women that they might not see in men.
What do you think that is?
Yeah, I think, it's that we are raised socially in terms of gender to express and to feel different emotions. And I think if you take an intersectional lens to that too, it's not all the same for each person, right? So me as a white woman, I might be seen as vulnerable, anxious, sad, and in need of support. But then, for example, in the book, Tammy Reese, who is a Black woman in the U.S., she shares her experience of feeling as though she's always seen as powerful and angry. And so a doctor, may not see those same emotions in her, may not think she needs the same support, and may not provide it.
You also talk, and we've talked about this on the program extensively, how many women say that they feel dismissed by their doctors. That this can be, just recently we were talking about IUDs, for example. This can be about endometriosis, that the pain that women go through is often dismissed, that it's not evaluated or recognized or treated perhaps in a way that is commensurate with the pain that people are going through. How does that play out with mental health, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very similar. I think one way it plays out is that we're told, oh, you're just stressed out. Pat on the back, you'll be okay, go home and do some self-care and you'll feel better.
And yet stress is a part of this too, right? And the emotional burden of life.
Absolutely. Stress is a part of it. And sometimes, yes, we maybe don't need to do anything about that. Maybe we just have to feel that stress and get through it. But I think the problem is if you're sending someone off and then those symptoms are becoming worse and deteriorating, mental illness we know gets worse over time. And there's this lag in diagnosis where girls and women are just not getting the diagnosis early enough to be able to provide effective treatment. So there's that one way. And then I'd say the other way is if you do receive a mental health diagnosis, that follows you around everywhere. And so any interaction you have with a healthcare provider, that's what they see on your chart. And sometimes I think that affects how the healthcare provider will address your issues. So you may go in and talk about, I have a chronic pain, I have excessive bleeding, perhaps it's endometriosis. And instead of focusing on that, they immediately see anxiety on your chart. So they say, how's your mental health doing? And they that's where they go to. And it's even made worse when you go into the doctor's office and you show emotion. So not only do you have this diagnosis, but you also are showing emotion. You may be tearful. And so they just zone in right on that.
It speaks to the title of your book. It's all in your head.
Exactly. So then you're missing a diagnosis potentially. I had a man reach out recently on Instagram who said that his mother had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, just like my grandmother, in midlife. And it turns out she had a brain tumor and she died at 55 because she didn't receive treatment on time.
What did you hear when people are receiving treatment? What did you hear from women about their experiences, particularly with antidepressants?
Yeah, I think it was a mixed bag for antidepressants. So some people I spoke to thought that antidepressants were amazing, that they were life-giving, in certain instances life-saving. So they can be enormously helpful. But I think, women like myself also faced a lot of significant side effects and a lot of trouble trying to come off the medication when we felt like it was time. And the science does support that females absorb and metabolize and eliminate drugs from our bodies at differing rates. We have higher blood concentrations, longer elimination time. So we could actually be experiencing worse side effects from these medications. And yet when we bring it up, we're told, just stay on the meds. You want to be a good mother, or you want to, be a productive member of society.
This is going to bring you back in some ways.
Exactly.
What should women do in the face of that?
I think it's challenging. I mean, for myself, I basically took matters into my own hands. When I was told I should probably just stay on the meds, I decided no, I didn't want to, and I just tried to wean myself off. But it was so challenging, and the withdrawal symptoms lasted for such a long time that I often felt like the anxiety and depression came back as part of that withdrawal period, and then I would just have to go back on the medication and start the cycle all over again. And
again, socially, there's a stigma around that as well. Not even getting onto the meds, but getting off of them, because the belief is this is going to help you, and this is going to help you plus.
Yes, and the belief is if it's happened more than one time, so if it's not just a one-off and you've come back many times with different diagnoses over the years, someone's going to ultimately say to you, you should just stay on this medication for life. Which, if that's working for you, great, please do that. For myself, it was not working. I wanted an alternative, and I wasn't given one, and I wasn't provided the support to really help me come off of them over the long term, although ultimately I did.
In the book you talk, and we've hinted at this, and part of this is around stress, but it's more than that. You talk about burnout as well. How should we be talking about, this is something that I think a lot of people in society experience, but in the context of this, how should we be talking about burnout?
So I think we need to be talking about burnout beyond an occupational context. So right now we talk about burnout as a work problem. But for women, when we know that there's higher caregiving burdens, we know that there's a higher burden of emotional labor, what we sometimes call mental load, a lot of that, most of it, happens in your personal life, in your home. And so if we're just talking about burnout as strictly an occupational thing, how are we ever going to address that part of it and that part of mental load that is really invisible and we don't have any way of tracking it currently?
I mean, the chapter is titled, Are You Mentally Ill or Mentally Overloaded?
Yes.
Well, I mean, what's the answer?
I didn't come to a very, there was no answer. I was trying to find out, could, we be misdiagnosing women that they are in fact experiencing burnout in this kind of wider context, but we're diagnosing it as mental illness. And I really couldn't find an answer there. But there is some research to suggest that the path from mental illness to burnout might be a little bit stronger. So yes, it's very hard to sort out what comes first. It's kind of a chicken and egg question.
What should we do? I mean, no matter whether it was the chicken or the egg, what should we do with that?
Yeah, so I think one answer is always self-care, right? It's coming back to the individual and saying, you need to do something to fix this problem to make yourself feel better.
What do you make of that phrase, self-care? I mean, we're doing a whole series on wellness, and self-care ends up being one of those buzzwords or phrases that people throw around, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
It can, and I think its roots are really found in the women's and civil rights movements eras of the 1950s and 1960s. And self-care at that time was a way for equity-deserving groups to reclaim their bodies and disrupt, patriarchy, disrupt white supremacy. But at a certain point around the same time, it just became co-opted by a very large wellness industry. And that wellness industry has just grown and grown and grown. And so in my mind, I think self-care can be authentic. I think we can bring it back to not only just the self, but the community as a whole. Because for some people, self-care is about caring for others, is about caring for your community. And I don't think we can remove that piece of it from the definition.
There's a bit in the book that, in the context of talking about things that people are struggling with, will grab people's attention because it says, what is the good news? In the context of all of this, where it feels like more people are struggling, and maybe the ways out of that have been co-opted or commercialized, what have you. What is the good news? What are you, in doing this research, what were you intrigued by or encouraged by when it comes to where the research may lead you down the road?
Yeah, that was a question I posed to all of the experts in my book was, are you feeling hopeful, or what are you feeling hopeful about? And it would probably depend on the day how they answered. Some kind of sighed and said they feel like some days we aren't making any headway. You look to our neighbors in the South and you see that some rights are being clawed back at this time, and we feel like at times we're going backwards. But I do still think that people feel hopeful in that there has been a large call to action for women's health in general. We're talking about it so much more. I mean, I'm on this program talking about it, so clearly something is changing. But I think we need to, when we're talking about women's health, not leave mental health behind. It's not just about reproductive rights. It's about so much more, and it's about a holistic way to look at women's care. Are
there treatments that gave you some optimism, aside from the data and the fact that there is a conversation that might be, to your point, being steered more towards mental health beyond just physical health? Are there treatments that you think are really intriguing?
I think the approach that we can take for therapy and taking a body-based approach seemed to be very intriguing to me because it's worked for me. So for a very long time, I jumped around from therapist to therapist to therapist trying. Everyone would try some sort of version of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. And that was helpful only to a point. And that's what so many other women in the book said to me, that CBT was great, but it just over the long term didn't seem to work. And what did seem to work, at least for myself, was a somatic type therapy where you are starting to reconnect with your body.
What does that mean, to reconnect with your body? It can mean practically and specifically.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes what happens is we end up seeing our body from the outside as some kind of object and having no understanding of what sensations we're feeling that might be telling ourselves something important. And so neuroscience now is showing that when our emotions are created in the brain, that it's using internal body sensations, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our cortisol, our the butterflies you get in your stomach. It's using all of that to actually decide what you are feeling. And so if we walk around all the time just thinking, and thinking that, we can change our thoughts and that will change our behavior, we're never really getting to what is going on in the body itself and how we feel and what those butterflies might be telling us or what the tightness on our chest might be trying to tell us.
Do you mind me asking for you personally? I mean, what has helped you the most?
I would say somatic therapy has helped me the most. And also, I'm almost 44. So I would say time and wisdom, right? I when I fall into what I call my dark holes now, they're so much shallower. I'm able to sit in there and go, you know what? I really hate this. I'm back here again. But because I've done it so many times before, I know I can get myself out of it. And so I've obviously had that time to be able to learn what works best for me. And I would add to, taking care of my body, moving my body in a way that feels good to me. And I walk in nature. I walk in green space. And I had several women tell me that too, that's what helped them was being able to get out in some kind of green space. It does not have to be climbing a mountain. It can be, sitting in a park, watching the birds.
When we started talking, you mentioned that interview that you heard on Tapestry on CBC Radio. You were driving on the highway, I think, and this was a way to keep yourself awake. Yes. By turning the radio on. Mm-hmm. This was an interview with the Irish poet John O'Donoghue. Mm-hmm. I remember hearing this interview the first time, and I think I've listened to it half a dozen times since. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to play a little clip of it. Have a listen.
There's a place in the soul that neither time, nor flesh, nor any created thing can ever touch. So that means that there's a place within you where no one has ever got to you, where you're not damaged or where there's no negativity in you, but where there is a pure tranquility within you. And I think that's very important to say to people, that you don't need gurus, you don't need so much outside stuff. If you withdraw into your inner sanctuary, you will find everything that you need.
You said that hearing that was a moment of clarity and truth.
Mm-hmm. It still gives me shivers. I love it. I think that it was coming to the realization in that moment. It was very sudden that there's nothing I need to fix about myself. And that was such a profound shift for me. And it was really freeing. And I realized what I'm going through is not my problem. Yes, it is, I'm feeling those consequences individually, but I don't have to fix anything. And in fact, there's this, I think I just jotted it down. He said, inner sanctuary. There's this place inside of me that I can actually draw from to get myself through. And ever since hearing that, every time I've struggled, I've been able to just close my eyes and think, John O'Donoghue told me there's a place inside of me. And I've been able to draw from that place and get through to the next part.
It's really beautiful, isn't it?
It's so beautiful.
Yeah. I'm really glad to talk to you. This is a book about a lot of things, but it's about you and inspired in many ways by what you heard there, but also that place that you found. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Misty Pratt's new book is called All in Her Head: How Gender Bias Harms Women's Mental Health.